Hello, students of the short story. It's Mr. Bones Day. I like this story, Mr. Bones, a lot. I think maybe more for personal reasons than anything. But I do want to talk a little bit about I sent out a video clip from CBS Sunday Morning and a couple of photographs. What's going on in this story, and whether it's the main idea. No, I don't think it is the main idea. But the dad is in a minstrel show, which, as you saw, was white people in blackface performing. And this is in the 1950s when it was still done by small organizations. Personally, I know many people who performed in these minstrel shows in the 1950s locally. And they always say they didn't mean anything by it. They claim the humor that the jokes they told were at the expense of each other and people in town, not necessarily racist in nature, but you can see the tradition that they're working in, whether they're aware of it or not, is certainly a mocking tradition of African Americans. But there are things that we do today that we think are perfectly fine, that I'm sure 50 years from now people will look back on and say, what were those fools doing back in 2021 thinking that was a good idea? But this story, I don't think the main idea is tied to the minstrel show, but it is a very important plot device. I'll get right to the point. Let me tell you what I think Paul Theroux's Mr. Bones is about. It is about our narrator, the boy, and his growing up and his relationship with his father, and also looking back, right? So this is an adult writing this story about a period in his childhood. It's not a child telling the story; those are good stories. But this is an adult looking back, trying to make some sense of his childhood. And most of you, even if you're 17, 18 years old out there, you're getting to the point. And I know this from seeing writing from my students over the years, you're getting to the point where you're starting to look back on your youth, even though you're still very young. You're looking back on your youth and starting to try to sort of make sense of it. You're replaying certain stories in your head. You don't do that when you're 12, right? Or 15 maybe. But when you start to get close to 20, you kind of start looking back and saying, and this is a good thing, right? This is a good thing to think about your story. Again, one of the reasons we study short stories is we are all a story, right? We all have, we're all an anthology of short stories. Ours all fit together and make us up. But we look back. I do it constantly. I'm always thinking back to certain episodes in my life, consciously, or they just happen randomly in my head. Like what was that all about, And one natural thing to do is to think about your parents, and especially for this young man, this older man looking back, he thinks a lot about his dad. He's a son. The father-son relationship, mother-son relationship, they're both great relationships. But I think particularly for a male, and maybe female more with mom, maybe not, maybe there's no difference here. I'm not even going to go down that line of thought. So the boy, let's look at the opening paragraph, because you remember I told you opening paragraphs are important, especially with the old stories, even though this is not an old story. This was written fairly recently. Whenever I get sentimental and tell people how my father used to read to me and encourage me, I realize that I'm lying. Is it a gesture of kindness toward him? Like, you look marvelous, something he used to say, or pretty as a picture, seldom true, or looks good enough to eat, my mother's grizzly meatloaf. Ugh. Generosity, I suppose, can often verge on the satirical. That's a nice line, when he's very generous, reminiscing to people about his father. Whenever I get sentimental and tell people, he is very generous, and of course at some point it becomes satire. It becomes ironic what he is saying. There is a difference between what we might tell people about our youth, about our past, and how we process the stories ourselves. It doesn't mean we're lying. It just means we have a persona that we sculpt. All right, let's get down to business here, Berninger. So I want to focus on the dad here. He is a sort of an archetype or stereotype in literature. He's a little bit like Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle, goes up into the mountains, and he lives the life of a henpecked husband, goes in the mountains and falls asleep for 20 years. This guy has a very different experience going in the minstrel show, but it's a similar sort of kind of browbeaten husband. And I find every character in this story sympathetic. I find, and it's up to you, I think every character in this story is worth having some type of sympathy for. This family is upper lower class, lower middle class. Money is a struggle. They're trying to get a house. They have $500. The dad doesn't know what to do. We got, and just boom, he just in a fit, right? He says, "Here's the money. We're buying this house," because he just can't think about it anymore. He just has this sort of spasm and does it. And the mom, of course, has lots of complaints because she's anxious. She's got all these kids to feed. The dad doesn't have a job that pays super well. It's a family under a lot of stress, and that's difficult. And we see that pressuring these people into not really being maybe their best. But that happens when you live under this kind of pressure. So. Dad, though, goes through this. So the son, before we get to Dad in the minstrel show, the son is very, very observant. Our narrator is very observant. "My father believed, he prays twice who sings to the Lord," was printed on the hymnal. The father, maybe his only outside the house activity is singing with the church choir. "My father believed that choir practice was more than a form of devotion, expression of piety. It was a spiritual duty. Dad always went alone, and he always came back happy. His happiness wasn't audible in anything he said, but his mood was improved. You could tell by his movements, his breathing, the way he listened with a different sort of smile, a relaxed posture." So our narrator here is an exceptional observer of people, and in this story of his father. By looking at his father's movements, his breathing, the way he listened, his smile, his relaxed posture. And kids are always watching us. Think back to when you were a kid and the observations, looking at the adults in your life. As adults, this is easy to forget, but we shouldn't. We are always setting an example for our kids. So that's very important. But the father has this sincere happiness when he comes back from singing in the church choir. The father also has his job is in the shoe store, and I think one of the most interesting parts of this story is the son actually goes and spies on his father. He looks in the window at the shoe store. One day after school, I went to the store where he worked. Instead of walking in, I kept my head down and crept to the side window to get a glimpse of Dad. He was sitting in one of the chairs in the shoe department, his chin in his hand, like Rodin's famous statue, The Thinker. His chin in his hand, looking not like Mr. Bones, but sad and silent, like a man trying to remember something. The other clerks had gathered at the back of the store and were laughing, but not Dad. Were they ignoring him? He paid no attention. He was reading. Unusual, a shoe clerk reading. I didn't know this man either. This is fascinating, isn't it? Did you ever do anything like this when you were a kid? Even in the house? Hopefully you weren't looking in places you shouldn't. Get an eyeful there, huh? But, just sort of secretly observing adults who are in your life. And when they're alone, and he's not quite alone, but he is alone in the store, sitting in the chair, and he's reading, and this is like, wow, a shoe clerk reading. I didn't know this man either. So the father is not able to be himself at home. He doesn't know who to be, and then of course he puts on the black face. But we'll get to that in a minute. One other thing. When the son, the father sells shoes, so he's often bowing, kind of kneeling down, putting shoes on customers. A good job. You need a good pair of shoes and a good fit. But there's sort of this subservience of kneeling down in front of someone. Not that that's a bad thing. So, this family is under tremendous stress of trying to make their way. They've got 4 kids, I think. That's a lot of kids to feed on a shoe salesman's salary. And the stress is really, really showing. And because of that stress, they're not pushed closer together. They're actually pushed apart. It somehow pushes them all apart from each other, which is very sad. And then Dad comes home one day, and he's got an envelope with songs in it, minstrel songs. And why don't we pick up there in our next part.